Bueno.
Okay, I'm going to be speaking about the art world for the last 120 years. So, that's a metaphysical debate. What should artists be allowed to represent? The entire world and engage with it, or portions of it? Now, what's the reason for this prohibition here? And again, there's a philosophical reason. The argument is that the spiritual world, God cannot be represented because he is a purely spiritual being, and the physical is low, it's base, it's in many cases disgusting. So if you try to take something that is pure and high and beautiful, the gods, and capture them in physical form, that is blasphemy. That is a degradation, and you shouldn't do that. So again, before we can be an artist, we have to make some religious and philosophical decisions about what our subject matter is going to be. Now, we're interested also not necessarily in the world out there and the gods or God, we're also interested in ourselves. Well, who are we? What is it to be a human being? And then we look at those Greek statues, and what we see is human beings are beautiful, powerful, erotic, right? Noble, dignified. And when the Greeks are portraying the gods, right, and they have, of course, many gods, they are portraying them in human form, like the gods are just really awesome human beings. And we get the sense that we as human beings are pretty special ourselves, and if we work on ourselves, we can become almost godlike. And how wonderful is that? And that is a very powerful philosophical assessment about what it is to be a human being. But at the same time, we know there are many who will make the judgment about human beings that they are sinful, that they are weak, that they are hypocrites, they're disgusting, right? They engage in all sorts of betrayals, and they know what is good, but they do not do what is good, and so they should feel ashamed of themselves, they should feel guilty, and they should fall to their knees and press their faces into the dirt and ask for forgiveness. Now, if you were an artist and you were going to portray what it is to be a human being, right, you were going to go in very different directions, right? The Greek direction versus the human beings are shameful and should cower and fall down. And what about politics? Should we, in our art, say anybody can be represented? We're interested in all human beings from all walks of life. Or since we know that art is so powerful, is art something that should be politically controlled? And only artists who are doing representations perhaps of kings or aristocrats or generals who have accomplished something, maybe Olympic athletes who are doing something very special. But only art, because of its importance, is allowed to do special human beings. And people who are not worthy, those should not be the proper subject matter of art. So, do we believe that art should be free and accessible to all human beings, that we should be interested in the full range of human experience, or is art politically something that should be controlled and reserved for those whom the political leadership considers to be important? And then the subject matters. What do we think about sex? What do we think about race? What do we think about power and justice? The whole range of values. Do we let artists express anything they want? Or do we say some viewpoints are morally wrong and they should not be allowed to be expressed? So the point of all of this is now we're raising questions about metaphysics and the nature of reality, what it is to be a human being. What are the important values? Should people be free or controlled? Should we be egalitarian or elitist? And all of those philosophical questions have great bearing on how artists. So to be an artist, you have to engage with those questions, and that's part of the power of art. And it also explains why in art history, art has gone through various cycles of engagement and disengagement, higher aspirations and lower aspirations, depending on what the prevailing philosophy of the era has been. Now, that said, I want to jump to our era, right? And I want to bracket it by the year 1917 because it was about a century ago, so the mathematics is almost perfect, right? Because we're 2019 now. But three things happened in 1917 that are indicative of the time period and what has changed or not changed since 1917. So I want to give you the first one. Here's the first one. All right. I could do this as an art history test, right? Whose work is this? So this is Marcel Duchamp. This is a work called Fountain, and it was exhibited in New York in 1917. New York had just recently become the new center of the art world. This is a statement, what's going on in New York in 1917. Now, Duchamp is an artist. This is, well, you recognize what this is, right? Well, not really. Well, maybe. But yes, he went to a hardware store, bought a urinal, took it back. He put this R-Mutt, he just wrote that on there, sent it in, of course, the date, 1917, and this is his statement about art. Now, why this matters? Because if you go 1 century later, we're now into the 2000s, and there's a survey done of British and American artists, over 1,000 of them, asking them to name the most important, influential artist on their thinking and development as an artist. Now, we would come up with all sorts of names, right? We might say Andy Warhol, we might say Pablo Picasso, and those guys came in second and third. Number one most important artist of the 20th century, according to leading 20th century artists, was this guy, Marcel Duchamp. And that's interesting. So what is going on with this, such that not only is it part of the art world, but it is judged by those inside the art world as the most important piece of art of the past century. And it is still with them. And then also 1917, the Russian Revolution. It's a bit of a cliche. Of course, artists have always been engaged with politics. It's always there. But one of the very interesting things about the last 100 years is how much politics is front and center in much of the art world. So it's not just that art is about family life and religion and nature and human beings and sex and politics too, right? For much of the 20th century, politics has come to be the most important aspect, and for many artists and sub-movements within modernism and postmodernism, it is explicitly and almost exclusively a political exercise. And of course, the portion of the political spectrum, I don't know how you divide the political spectrum, right, or if you need multiple spectra, but the portions of the political spectrum that are most dominant within the art world for the last century is relatively narrow. It's a small portion of the political spectrum that has been dominant. So let's ask why. Now, I want to give you some quotations. That was 1917. And what you might expect is, the way art goes, is that for 20 years, 30 years, maybe 40 years, there's this new artistic movement, new approach arises. It dominates for a while, but then people get bored, they get tired, they want something new. And the artists themselves get bored and tired, and they say, oh, we've already seen that many times. I want to do something new and fresh and original. So by the time we get to the 1960s, that's already then been 40 years or 50 years of a certain approach to art. And we see certain themes starting to be repeated over and over again. So let me give you a series of commentators. This is 50 years ago. I'll start with one from the Russian-born novelist Ayn Rand, speaking about what has happened in the modern art world. Quote, when modern artists declare that they don't know what they are doing or what makes them do it, we should take them at their word and give them no further consideration. Now notice that that's 50 years ago, and we have a perceptive person working inside the art and literature world saying, okay, we've listened, we've given you your chance, you're saying you don't know what you're doing, and you've been doing it for 40 years, let's stop listening to these artists anymore and go and do something different. 50 years ago. 40 years ago, the Mexican poet and Nobel Prize winner Octavio Paz. Today, modern art is beginning to lose its powers of negation. So modern art was about negation, critique, and so forth, but it's losing its powers. Why? Well, because we've just been hearing the same thing over and over again, right? For some years now, its rejections have been ritual repetitions. So pausing, ritual, right? You're just going through the motion, it's the same thing over and over again. Rebellion has turned into procedure, criticism into rhetoric, etc. Negation is no longer creative. Pause right there. What an insult to artists to say that what you are doing is no longer creative. It's like the worst possible insult you can give to an artist. I'm not saying that we are living the end of art. We are living the end of the idea of modern art. So 40 years ago, modern art was over, according to Octavio Paz. 30 years ago, Egyptian-born literary critic Ihab Hassan. The postmodern period is driven repetitively by a vast will to unmaking, affecting and dissolving the body, cognition, eroticism, the psyche, and the entire realm of discourse of the West. So what are you saying? 30 years ago, okay, modern artists are dissolving everything. They're breaking everything down, but now they've done everything. Everything has been broken down to emptiness. 20 years ago, art critic, as an American art critic, Donald Cuspit, quote, "In the art world, such facile nihilism." Okay, that's nihilism, emptiness, no value. So that's dominating the art world, but it's facile, and that's an English word that means kind of juvenile and empty. Such facile nihilism passes for critical profundity when in fact it is simply farce. And farce is silly comedy, right? You know, it's the Three Stooges and right, silly stuff. So 20 years ago, perhaps the leading art critic is saying, it's over, it's done, it's empty, it's facile, right, and so forth. And I'm starting to feel like an old man. Over 10 years ago, when I started to write about art, I wrote, and this was my prediction, right? The world of postmodern art is a rundown hall of mirrors reflecting tiredly some innovations introduced a century ago. It is time to move on, right? Unquote.